special event about careers and internships at the State Department. I'm Jason Arnold, the chair of the Political Science Department. Today is our final event in our fall 2022 series about careers and internships. I hope some of you were able to attend our event last week with Ambassador Hashigian, Daniel Ricchetti, and our own Professor Bill Newman. If you weren't able to make it, we're going to try to get the video edited up and put up on the website so you can watch that. It's worth watching. Today we're fortunate to have Carolyn Coberly as our featured guest. Professor Coberly is currently a visiting professor at Wake Forest University's Department of Political Science. And she's completing her PhD at the University of Virginia in the Department of Politics. But more relevant for today's discussion, Professor Coberly will be talking about her 12-year stint as a Foreign Service officer in the State Department, where she specialized in Iran while serving posts in Dubai, Ankara?
Yeah, Turkey.
Turkey, and DC. In addition to that experience, she spent time, I think it was 3 years, doing other work, especially focused on Afghanistan, where she also spent time in Kabul, in addition to work in Washington, D.C. at headquarters. Professor Coberly has additional career experiences that you may want to ask her about. She might bring it up, but if she doesn't, it'll be up to you to bring it up. She spent a few years working as staff and a legislative assistant in Congress for two very prominent politicians, Senator Ted Kennedy, who was a lion of the Senate, and Representative Jane Harman, who was a specialist in national security.
Yeah.
Remember? Yeah. And say that again?
She's at the Wilson Center now. Anyway, she moved on, but yeah.
She moved on. She went after Congress. She spent time at the Wilson Center. In addition to providing valuable information about State Department careers and internships and how to get onto that pathway, although there are multiple ways to get there, I'm sure Professor Coberly will talk about her experiences working as a Foreign Service officer in these various posts around the world, in addition to generally what it's like to embark on this sort of path. Enough for me. I'm going to pass the torch over to Professor Coberly, and thank you all for coming today.
Hello, everybody. It is great to meet you. Again, my name is Carolyn, or you can call me Carrie Coberly. Students never call me by my first name, so if you want to call me Professor Coberly, that totally works too. I am really excited to talk to you all today about careers in the State Department. As Professor Arnold mentioned, though, I also worked on Capitol Hill for a couple of years. I've done track 2 diplomacy and other types of diplomatic work after the State Department as well. So I'm really happy to answer any of the questions that you all have. And I'd like this to be a relatively informal session, so please interrupt with questions as we go along. Just stop me and say, hey, wait, what was that? And I'm more than happy to clarify and talk even more about myself. It's always fun. So let's see. My primary goal here today is to convince you all to apply for internships with the State Department. But I did want to start with what people do in the State Department generally. And because everybody sort of has this general conception that diplomats spend all their time going to parties and having a lot of fun, it's a lot of chit-chat, things along those lines. And yes, 100%, you totally go to parties. It is a lot of fun, although it's actually a lot of work as well. Working a party is much harder than you think. So this is definitely a part of it, but most of my career was actually spent more in situations like this. These are photos of me from Afghanistan, where I'm talking with local government figures in an eastern province of Afghanistan about migration policy, how they can better integrate Afghans who are returning to their country after a couple of years to reduce the refugee crisis in Pakistan. Or I'm talking to the refugees themselves. This is in western Afghanistan in Farah province. Hearing how the development programs that we had put in place for them, we built a well, we built a school, things like that, how those programs are actually working for them, and what else needs to happen to actually help them build stable lives in the country. I spent time, because I have a lot of Afghanistan photos, so we get a lot of Afghanistan photos here. So the time you spend as a State Department diplomat is a lot of bureaucracy. There's a lot of desk work, there's a lot of analysis, reading, and writing, but there's also a lot of opportunities to actually go monitor elections, to design and implement assistance programs, things along those lines. It's a wide range of work that you can do, and I always found it immensely satisfying. Oops. Oh, we can just go with that. How exciting. Equally satisfying, of course, were the people that I met along the way. Whether it was in training to learn how to do visas, which is an important part of everything you do, or the people that you go on a really random TDY to Iraq with, and spend your time living in tents and talking and hanging out with 24/7. It was a great community of Americans, local workers, international aid fellows. Everybody who you meet along the way really is what makes it all worthwhile. Oops. I can't figure out forward and backward, sorry about that. So when I encourage people to consider careers in the State Department or in the Foreign Service, I do it because it really is a job where you can have a global impact, where you actually make a difference to people's lives. Whether it's that person who you interviewed for a visa and are giving a chance to actually go study in the United States, or do a summer project or program in the United States. Or if it is a group of refugees who you were able to actually help with not just building a school, but making sure that that school is actually funded ongoing by the Afghan government. It's a lot of meetings, it's a lot of work, but it's immensely satisfying. Now, global impact, you work with multinational teams. And ultimately, the main reason why you should join the Foreign Service, though, is to serve your country. I had a lot of photos from Afghanistan there, and there is always a point where the State Department is going to break your heart. And the collapse of Afghanistan and the collapse of a lot of the work that we had done there is really hard to take. But that concept of service, not just to yourself, not just to your country, but also hopefully to the international community as well. Even though not everything that we did is going to last in Afghanistan, those clinics, those wells are still there. Those people still had opportunities to get additional training, and that's not going to disappear overnight. And hopefully, in a few years, we can again build a better future together. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't mention, this was never the most important thing like 10 years ago when we talked about careers in the State Department, but I find students really find this appealing now, so I'll go ahead and mention it. It's a great career just in terms of overall stability. There's loan repayment programs. It is a good job in and of itself. But I did not actually start out just diving straight into the State Department. I actually started out by doing 3 different internships for the State Department. And I interned in Athens, Paris, and Sarajevo. My life was very difficult. And was initially actually kind of hesitant. Those first 2 internships in Europe, really cushy places, really fun to be there. But it wasn't the most fun experience. It wasn't what I found most satisfying. I didn't realize that the State Department could be a career for me until I worked at a harder place. I was in Sarajevo in Bosnia 5 years after their civil war. I talked to victims of war crimes. I talked about economic development programs. And so I actually got to have this hands-on experience working with people whose lives I could actually genuinely help and impact. And so sometimes it can take a little while to figure things out. And that's why I am a big advocate of State Department internships. Because one reason why you want to do this internship is, hey, see, maybe do I want to work in the State Department? Maybe not. But even if you're not sure if you want to work in the State Department, these are some of the best internships out there that you can get anywhere. These are incredibly substantive experiences. You essentially act as a Foreign Service officer or a civil servant in Washington, D.C. You fill in for regular diplomats because it's the summertime and there are a lot of gaps. You do the same work that diplomats do, especially at the entry level. You attend meetings, you attend trade fairs, you report on what's going on, you manage clearance processes and send memos up the line. You are acting as if you are a diplomat. And it's great on your resume, but it's also just a great experience in general to understand the professional world that you might enter. And also, State Department internships are now paid. Yay! And you have to get a security clearance for it. So this is, getting a security clearance is actually a door opener to lots of other types of internships and jobs as well. So having this opportunity to get that, it's just a secret level, but it's a really good entryway to future clearances in government jobs. Questions before we move on? All right. So there are lots of different types of internships you can do. I'm primarily today going to talk about some summer internships, but this is not the only opportunity that you all have. There are virtual internships that you can do throughout the year. Typically you apply in the summer for internships in the fall semester and spring semester. And so it's something that you need to arrange with faculty here at VCU and figure out how you can integrate that into your academic experience. But these are of all sorts. There are also what are called pathways programs, and these are often telework eligible. It is essentially working part-time for the State Department while you are also enrolled in school. These are typically in underrepresented fields like diplomatic security or information technology, but there are pathways opportunities in a wide range of areas. But the most common thing that we tend to think of are student internships for the summer. And there are two main types of programs that the State Department has here. One is a 2-year program that you apply for when you're a sophomore. So this would be something to consider if you're a first-year student right now, because you apply you apply for this in September of your sophomore year. This is one reason why we talk about State Department internships. None of this is user-friendly. Unfortunately, it's a great introduction to how the bureaucracy works. So you apply for the 2-year program, the U.S. Foreign Service Internship Program, very early in your sophomore year. Otherwise, it's exactly the same as the regular student internship program, which I'll talk more about now. And the regular State Department internship program is a program that you apply for literally right now. The application period is open for 1 week, and it closes on Monday of this month. So Monday, it's November. Monday, November 7th. All right. Any questions on this before I move on to the actual details? All right. So, to apply for summer internships in the State Department, there are a couple of basic criteria. You do need to be a U.S. citizen, and all of these programs require you to be an ongoing student. So you need to be enrolled for the next year. For the summer internship, they actually require you to be a junior. They get enough applications that I got my first internship when I was a sophomore. That's unfortunately just no longer an option. When they started paying people, they started requiring you to be a junior. So if you are a junior, now is the time to apply. If you are a sophomore or younger, now is the time to think about it for next year or think about virtual internships. And yeah, this is literally changing information as we go. So the other common time to apply for this internship is halfway through your master's program. That's how I did my last internship. I was a master's student, and that's when I went to Sarajevo for that summer, and I actually extended through 1 semester in college as well. Okay, so the applications are usually due in early November, and the window is actually open right now. I will put this up again in a minute and show you how to find the application process, but the closing date for the application is November 7th, and there is a very extensive application process. I'm going to go through a couple of key points in a moment, but for now I just want to highlight that you got to get this in relatively early. Because once you upload your, yes?
Can you apply to internships when you were applying for grad schools?
Yes, so if you're a senior and you intend to go immediately onto a grad school, you can apply. And that's, you're often very competitive for these, but they will want to see that you are going to be enrolled in a master's program in the fall. What they are interested in here is that they don't want you to expect to get a job immediately after this I'll show you where you do that on here, and I'll talk to you all about how to choose the right place to go. Yeah, because what you choose actually does make a big difference. Other questions? All right. So what happens once you upload your resume and your CV and your personal state? Sorry, your resume, your syllabus, no, the thing with your grades, your transcript. I'm really smart. And your personal statement. Then it goes to a central office in the State Department. It goes to Human Resources. HR will review everybody's applications for basic criteria, again, making sure you're an ongoing student, making sure that you have the adequate credit hours. You need a GPA of 3.2 for this particular program. Other programs have lower GPA requirements, just FYI. So they'll check those basic criteria, and then they will send your application out to one office. This will be based both on your overall competitiveness in the entire pool and on which office you chose. If the first office doesn't select you, they will send you on to a second office and potentially a third office. So the different choices that you make here, indications of what you actually want in the State Department, do matter a lot. And the office that's interested in you will, and typically offices will get between 6 and 20 resumes and personal statements from people. When I was working in the State Department, I tragically never actually got to hire a full intern like through the entire process. I interviewed several people. I always made that selection, but the security clearance always ended up being a problem. They've resolved most of those issues. I was also trying to hire Iranians, and that's always challenging, so for the State Department at least. So what was I going to say? Oh, so there's never a guarantee until you actually show up, but I would usually get a group of 6 or 8 CVs of qualified applicants that I could take a look at. I would interview 3 or 4 of them. So those are kind of the numbers that we're talking about here. You'll be interviewed, and then you'll find out if the office selected you or not. If you are selected by an office, then you get a security clearance. This process takes between 2 and 4 months nowadays. This is going much faster than it was when I was in the department 10 years ago. So this is, again, not usually a problem anymore, and it's a big plus. And then you start in early June, late May, just depends on your personal schedule. So that's the overall process. In terms of details, sorry, it's nice to actually have this up now. Oops. There are 4 key elements to your application, and then I'll pull them up on the actual application in a moment. You need to upload your resume. You don't need to have the world's most amazing resume in order to get a State Department internship. What people are looking for and what you should highlight in your resume is essentially attention to detail, no typos, clearly formatted, well-presented resume, and experiences that demonstrate your responsibility, diligence, and ability to essentially be given authority. If there's one stereotypical reason why you need to join the State Department, or why you should join the State Department, it is to serve your country. If there's one stereotypical quality that the State Department looks for in employees, it is good judgment. So if you were working a fast food job and you regularly showed up on time, you were able to handle the finances, you were given additional responsibility over time, those are all great qualities that the State Department looks for. It's nice if you can demonstrate writing skills, it's nice if you can demonstrate communication skills and experience, but responsibility, good, solid judgment, and an expansion of that responsibility over time are the most important things. And that can be demonstrated with any type of experience that you guys have. All right, so that's your resume. Your transcript, again, the requirements range from 2.0 GPA to a 3.2 GPA. And here it's typically not your overall GPA that matters most. I always thought it was weird when students put their GPA on their resumes. What you want to see is taking challenging classes, personal growth, actually seeking the right types of experience that might help you with a career. So like I was never really that great at economics. I never got very good grades in those classes. Yeah, sure, it dragged down my GPA a little bit when I took them, but those were important parts of, frankly, grad school applications and job applications, just demonstrating that I took the challenging classes that I needed to. All right. And then, so those are kind of general things. There are two specific things that you also need to do as part of this application. You need to select where you'd like to go, and you have like 4 questions that are essentially a long personal statement that describe what you'd like to do and why you're qualified to do that. So I'll talk through choice of office on a different slide, but on the personal statements, again, the key things here are genuine interest. You come off as honest and genuinely interested in whatever it is that you'd like to do, and your writing skills. If they ask you to write a short memo or write a short speech, would they feel confident in having you do that? Okay, so let's look at the application. Oh. I think I accidentally closed the actual application. Sorry about that. All right. You apply through usajobs.gov. This is a standard application portal for all U.S. government positions, and so once you upload your resume and transcript here, you can use that same resume and transcript for other jobs as well, which is convenient. And to find this, the easiest way is to go to usajobs.gov and type in State Department internship. This is literally the first thing that comes up, but I'll show you other places to find it too. All right, so there's lots and lots of details here. Scroll down, scroll down, scroll down. What you want to do to start is to click on Preview Questions. And what this does is this shows you all the questions that you'll have to fill out as part of the application process when you hit Apply. And the first 24 questions are all logistical. Are you a U.S. citizen? Are you a junior or above? Please confirm that you would actually be able to work over the summer. How much education do you have? It goes on and on. Foreign language proficiency can be very helpful. Enter that here. All right. And then question 25 is where the detailed questions actually get started. So the first thing that they ask you here is where you'd like to work. Do you want to work domestically, or do you want to work overseas? Domestic can be essentially in Washington, D.C., or at the U.S. mission to the UN in New York City. There aren't a ton of jobs in New York. Most of these domestic jobs are in D.C. All 3 of my internships were overseas, and I highly recommend it. I used to recommend it because it was the more affordable way to do this internship, frankly. When you go overseas, now they will both pay you, but they also provide your housing. So you still have to make your own way, find financial support from the university, for example, to pay for your plane ticket to get overseas, but you can count on housing and a basic salary to cover food and things like that while you're there. If you want to go overseas, though, the biggest criteria there that will determine where they send your application is what languages you have. So I was able to intern my first summer, the summer after my sophomore year in Athens, because I had taken a year of Greek. And that was also kind of a nepotism job and an extra job. I didn't cost the embassy anything because my dad was working there, so they didn't even have to provide me housing. So again, that's not normal for how you get the job nowadays. But what happened for my second internship with the State Department was I wrote this beautiful personal statement. I said I want to work domestically. I'd like to be in Washington, D.C. I want to work on an East European desk. And they called me up and said, hey, would you like to go to Paris? And I said, yes, of course I would like to go to Paris. And so they had sent my application to Paris because I have French language skills. So you know, they will take your preferences into consideration, but sometimes kind of random things happen. If you have the language skills to work in an overseas embassy, definitely take that opportunity. Again, it's so much fun. It's a fantastic experience. You typically will live with 2 or 3 other interns. In Paris, there were about 15 or 16 of us, and they happened to have a really large place for us all. We all worked in different offices. I worked in the economics section every time I worked with the State Department, or as an intern. So I was covering trade, I covered privatization, I had a couple of issues that were mine. And I was able to identify opportunities for meetings that I should go to and take. I would do research in French and in English, and would, you know, have a fun time. That admittedly was mostly a fun summer. That's overseas. And for domestic experiences, you'll need to express a preference of the types of issues that you care most about. So 2 notes here. If you do want to work overseas, you do have the language skills. Let's say you've got Spanish. They will then ask you where you'd actually like to go. And here's where you might want to consider some of the less popular places. Like Mexico City, amazing. What a wonderful city to go live and spend some time in over the summer. And they need a lot of interns there. They will take somewhere between 15 and 20 interns in Mexico City. But they also need people at all the other consulates in Mexico as well. They also need people in Argentina and Chile, which admittedly are popular, but maybe think about Paraguay or Uruguay. Some of the the countries that are a little less in the news, still really interesting and frankly pretty safe and comfortable as well. So lots of different opportunities to consider there. Like the classic example here is if you speak Russian, don't necessarily try to go to St. Petersburg or Moscow. Sign up for Tashkent, sign up for Almaty, amazing cities in Central Asia that also need Russian speakers and rarely get a lot of applications. Yeah.
Just when you say language proficiency, and what would be sort of the minimum level of proficiency that we have?
More is better. Again, I was able to work in Greece with very minimal Greek. Excuse me. It's my mom. She always gets through all the filters. Because many people in Greece will speak English, and I was working in an economics section where I didn't necessarily need to be speaking Greek every single day. So I could get by with some basic common courtesies and a basic understanding. When I was working in Sarajevo, I had 2 years of Serbo-Croatian that I had studied, and relatively intensely. And so I was able to do more work on my own, but I also was typically sent out with a translator whenever I would work things. Frankly, even when I was working in the State Department, in Persian and Dari in Afghanistan, I'd usually bring a translator to meetings because it's just a lot easier to take notes when you have built-in pauses to your conversation as you're going back and forth. So I would often handle meetings by, I would speak English and have that translated for my interlocutor, for whoever I was talking to. They would speak Persian or Serbo-Croatian. I've studied a lot of languages, and things along those lines. And then I would understand what they'd be saying because my comprehension skills are better than my speaking skills. I would get the general meaning of what they were saying, but I'd also occasionally ask for a translation so that I could take some notes. So more is better, more makes you more competitive, and especially if we're talking about a French language or Spanish-speaking post. Oh, and I should remind everyone that French opens up like most of Africa, which is fantastic. So many wonderful jobs there. So if you're going to those common language posts, you're going to need basic fluency. If you have a less common language or a harder language, Arabic or Chinese, for example, they might be able to do with less. Yes?
Did you develop your language skills after you got to Afghanistan, or were you already pretty comfortable speaking before that?
So when you're in the State Department, you don't actually need to speak any languages to join the State Department. Technically, you don't even need a college degree, although I never met anybody who didn't have a college degree in the State Department. The application process doesn't require any of these things. When you're actually in the Foreign Service, the State Department will teach you everything you need to know. So I came in with Russian and I guess I'll call it Bosnian because I was in Bosnia. There's a politics of languages. So, and I was like, I am so excited. I want to go to Russia. I want to go work in Eastern Europe. That's what I want to do. And you get a list of jobs when you first join the Foreign Service. There are 100 people in your training class. Here are 100 jobs. We're going to match every single person up with a job. And so I looked at this list of jobs, and I saw this job in Ankara, Turkey. And I was like, oh wow, I would do visas for Iranians. They would teach me Persian. That'd be amazing. And you know, maybe someday I could actually go open up an embassy in Iran. I'm still waiting, but you know, that would be a wonderful experience. And so I was like, that's what I want to do. I put that #1 on my list of choices, and I was very lucky to get my first choice for that job. So the State Department will teach you Persian. They will teach you any language. They will teach you Spanish if you don't come in with a language or French. And get you to the proficiency level that you need. Because as a diplomat, you're supposed to be at what's called a 3, essentially basic fluency or higher. Yeah. Yes?
So if you don't have language experience or proficiency, could you still put like both overseas and domestic on your application?
Yes. There are English language speaking posts, London, although you don't hold your breath. It's competitive. Lots of jobs in Africa as well, they're English speaking. I think Kenya, I think South Africa. It's great to have one of the local languages. It's great if you speak Swahili, but the lingua franca is English. Lingua franca in a lot of the Arab world as well, like in Dubai, is English as well. So there are opportunities where you could speak English and have that position overseas. Other questions?
Additionally?
Yes.
So if you put both, you mentioned that you would select, like if you said domestic, you would select area of interest.
Yep.
If you selected overseas, you'd select...
You select places.
places. Would you just do both?
Yeah, I would. So obviously this has changed a lot since I applied. When I applied, you just wrote down 3 places you wanted to be. If I were doing this, I would put both, and I would choose 2 offices in DC, and I would choose 2 embassies overseas. Because that's the next element that you need to think through here. They'll ask you what your primary field of interest is, and this is, again, where they're going to send your application in terms of offices in Washington, New York, or potentially overseas as well even if you don't sign up for it, but they need more Russian speakers, or they need more Spanish speakers, or Portuguese speakers. Brazil's really big. And then they may look for you there as well. So there are so many choices here, so many choices. And what I want to do is essentially break this down into 2 different categories. Because each of those choices on the application essentially correspond to one of the offices within the State Department. And there are 2 categories of offices, well, maybe 3. Some of them are regional bureaus. They are responsible for interacting with our embassies in Africa, our embassies in East Asia, in Europe. If you want Latin America, that's Western Hemisphere affairs. It includes Canada as well. I completely forgot Canada for both of you English and French speakers. Yeah, some of these offices are regional bureaus, and I recommend that you do select the region that you are most interested in as part of this application process. Just choose a regional bureau. But so many of these offices cover other issues as well. I worked very closely with the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration, which does exactly what it sounds like. The State Department has responsibility for managing the refugee process for people coming to the United States. Very satisfying. You do programmatic work. There's a lot of money involved. You also help individual people as well. So some of them are easy to figure out what they are. Some of them are more complicated. Political military affairs handles a lot of foreign military sales, the approval process for that. Public affairs does so much different type. Public affairs actually, that is specifically is essentially being the spokesperson for the United States. Maybe not as an intern, but you would certainly help prepare talking points for the State Department spokesperson. You would help escort and integrate foreign press people, the international press, when they're in Washington, D.C., and when they're in New York City, so that they have a positive experience interacting with the State Department, things along those lines. There are a couple of offices that handle terrorism. There's a specific anti-terrorism office, but there's also conflict and stabilization operations, which is essentially homeland security efforts internationally. So it's counterterrorism efforts sort of writ large. Some of these offices, like CT, handle designation of foreign terrorist organizations. Other offices handle assistance programs designed to prevent terrorism, things along those lines. So there are lots of different offices. I'm not going to go through each and every one of them, but if you go to careers.state.gov, click on internships, fellowships, student internship program. None of these things are, unfortunately, are easy to find. Internship assignments, yes, they hide everything. Which offices are the best fit for you? You can find this particular website, or you can just Google State Department offices, and frankly, a list of bureaus and offices is the first thing that will come up. So those are, and I just do a little bit of independent research on your own. And so I do also recommend that you choose what's called a functional bureau. One of these offices that manages these different issues on whatever issue you find most interesting and most important to you personally. Me, I'm big into refugees and democracy assistance, but I know that's not everybody's cup of tea. So decide what you care most about, what you'd like to learn most about, and identify the office that's the best fit. Any more questions on this? Had great ones. Yes?
So if you're graduating this year and unable to continue graduating to a master's program, what opportunities are there?
I will get there. Yeah. There are a couple of the Pathways internship. There are a couple of fellowships as well that you might want to consider as options. Or you could just apply for the State Department. You could take the Foreign Service exam. It usually takes a while to enter, and I can talk through that process as well. Yeah. No problem. And you can also just remember all of this wonderful and difficult to find information for when you're in your master's program. All right. Hit those things. There we go. And you can choose 2 offices. Yes?
So, is there any way to look into like what functional offices like specialize in what areas? Like,
yeah, so that's essentially where you have to do a little bit of Google research. What happens when you click on these offices is, let's go to when you find a whole list of offices, let's say you are pre-law and are maybe interested in seeing what lawyers actually do at the State Department. If you click on each of these offices, they're going to tell you their overall mission and the different types of offices that work for them. So we can just do a little bit of research there and identify what's going on. Sometimes it can be a little deceptive, so not necessarily in a bad way. It's because once you actually are in the system, sometimes you get moved to the place that they actually need you most when you're there. So one of my students this year interned this past summer in the Conflict and Stabilization Office, which does a whole bunch of different things. One of which, and what she was technically hired for, was data analysis and modeling of to predict future conflicts. It's something that they're trying to get more involved in and engaged in. Let's see if we can use analytics to figure out where the next refugee crisis is going to be, for example. So that's sort of what they talked about in the interview process. But when she got there, they essentially were down a person, and so she just filled in for the person who in the Office of Conflict and Stabilization Affairs for Western Hemisphere. So she went to all of the meetings for this office that had to do with Latin America. Venezuela was a big issue. Colombia sometimes comes up as well, for example. So sometimes you have to be flexible and see how things go. If you were to intern with the legal advisor, they handle basically everything. There's nothing that doesn't end up touching the legal office at the end of the day. I worked with the legal office a lot when I was doing the job I talk least about in the State Department. That's one of the jobs I worked on in Washington, D.C. on Afghanistan. I usually mention, oh yeah, I worked on building international aid and assistance. We talked to South Korea, we talked to Japan about boosting their overall aid programs. But I also worked on detainee policy. This is an Obama administration, and I was part of the team that was trying to figure out how we can close down our detention facilities in Afghanistan while still maintaining our national security, not just releasing people so that they could go join the Taliban again. How do we transfer people properly to the Afghan government, make sure that their human rights are respected throughout all of this? And how can the State Department monitor other agencies' actions in the region to make sure that they meet international criteria as well. So that has L written all over it. The legal office is all over that because every single aspect of all those issues has very specific international standards that you're supposed to comply with, and we usually did actually. But in addition, the process of changing that also meant that we had to be super careful and cautious about what the legal implications would be for people personally as well as for the U.S. government. So anyway, that's an example of the sort of thing you can learn. Yeah, I see some people having to pick stuff up. It's okay if you have to go. This is my email address. It's my last name, but not my last letter of my last name, and then my first initial. So coberly@wfu.edu. No problem. Thanks, guys. Yeah. Yes, you have a question.
What's the policy on, let's say that somebody is planning on taking the foreign service exam?
Yeah.
Could they still apply to go to fellowships or internships, or is it like C1 through the very end before you begin it?
No. Frankly, you should take the State Department, the exam, the Foreign Service exam, early and often. It typically takes 2 or 3 years after you initially take that exam to join the Foreign Service. It's a very long process. Both the exam takes a while, the second part of the exam takes a while, then you have to get a bigger and better security clearance, and then you have to actually get a slot in a training field. So I took the Foreign Service exam in September of 2001, and I joined the Foreign Service in November of 2002. And that was 14 months, and that's literally the fastest I've ever heard anybody actually making it through this process. So you can think of like 18 months as a minimum, and 2 or 3 years is much more typical. It's also extremely typical to fail the Foreign Service exam the first time. Most people do. So give yourself a couple of tries. Some people actually take it 7 or 8 times and finally get in. That persistence is awesome, that's fantastic. Most people take it twice and get in on the second time, maybe the third time. So it's a good idea to give yourself a little bit of flexibility, and because that is such a long process, people go to grad school in the interim, they get actual jobs in the interim, they apply for internships and things like that. So there's nothing preventing you from pursuing both at the same time. Cool. Yes?
Can you transfer from one institution to another, like from another?
As an intern or as a career? As a career. Yes, it is very bureaucratic and complicated, but it is possible. And what's most important is that once you have a security clearance, it's much easier to make these things happen. So people transfer within the State Department between different types of jobs. People will also sometimes transfer between agencies as well, state to DoD or CIA and things like that. Yes, sir.
I was just wondering if you could share with the students specifically what to look for to get security clearance. What are the details?
On security clearances, this is not something I've done. It's a good question now. It's not as scary as it sounds. Most of it is a basic criminal check. It's the same criminal records check you frankly get for most jobs. And what's important there is honesty. They're going to ask questions like, have you ever taken drugs, things like that. Just be honest. What they're looking for is not that you are a perfect person who's never ever done anything wrong. But what they are trying to make sure is that there is nothing that a foreign intelligence officer could blackmail you about. So if you are lying about something, if you're ashamed about something that you've done, that's the problem. If you smoked pot and it was illegal at the time, they don't really care. So that's the first thing on sort of criminal activity and criminal record. The second thing and this is what tends to be the problem, is foreign experience and foreign connections. So you have to list every single country you've ever traveled to, ever. And oh my gosh, this is so annoying. I mean, because I've been to a lot of countries now, and you have to do this every 5 years, like from the beginning, to re-update your security clearance. It gets really tedious and really long. And you have to list, okay, how many close friends do you have in each of these countries, and things like that. And close friends means actually close, like do you have relatives who live in other countries, things along those lines. None of this is a problem, none of this is disqualifying. They just have to check on every single aspect of that. And so it just ends up taking a really long time. That's why I was never able to hire an Iranian American as an intern. It wasn't because they were Iranian American, it's because their security clearance was taking between 6 and 9 months, and there were only 3 or 4 months in the process to actually hire somebody. So it just can often take a long time. The only thing I've ever seen people's security clearances sort of essentially getting shaped from is if you have close ties to a government official in another country. So one of the people who joined the Foreign Service with me very closely related to a couple of members of Mossad, the Israeli intelligence agency. She obviously was allowed to join the Foreign Service, but she wasn't allowed to go to Israel for her first 10 years. They wanted to see a better record and establishment of her loyalty to the United States, assurances that they wouldn't be sharing any information with Mossad, things like that. The other big question, because I get a lot of little people coming by and asking me security clearance questions for some of my students. The other thing that they really are looking for is, especially nowadays, are you likely to leak information to the press, to WikiLeaks? Are you going to be a new, the guy who's in Russia now? Thank you, a new Edward Snowden. That is the biggest thing that they're worried about with you young kids and your generation nowadays, is that you won't take the national security clearance concerns seriously enough. And so that's where, again, your demonstration of responsibility, your demonstration doesn't need to be like some huge loyalty test, but just that you understand that you're going to do this job and it's about more than your personal views. And that's one of the difficult things, again, about the State Department is no matter who you are, no matter what your political beliefs, there's always going to be a president that you disagree with who comes along. So I'm a moderate Democrat. I actually was hired in the Bush administration. I found it much more fun to work for Obama. But you have to separate part of your political views and your personal views from your career aspirations. It is about service to the country, not necessarily service to an individual person. And sometimes that can be really hard. A lot of people quit under President Trump. But that's the thing that you have to do. You actually either have to find a way to make the difference that counts for you, and there are lots of different ways to do that. It's maybe work on a less high-profile issue while somebody you disagree with is in power. I worked on Iran for President Bush, and I didn't agree with some of his overall policies, but I worked them to make them the best policies possible. I was very concerned. I love democracy, but actively promoting democracy overseas is not always the best way to help people. So I worked really, really hard to do no harm with our pro-democracy programs, to make sure we actually weren't getting people arrested, while still maintaining the core intent and the core goal of those programs. So there are lots of ways to make this happen, but leaking to the press is not the right one. So, and that's to get back to your question, that's the other thing that they're really concerned about on the security clearance. So if you have a bunch of international experience, connections or ties, again, not disqualifying, but hopefully they've just gotten a lot better at doing that a lot faster, and consider applying for a position in a place where you don't have a lot of family. Other questions? Yes?
Sorry.
This is great.
That
Yeah.
came to mind. So do they not recommend that you go to a country where you have family, or is it forbidden?
It would slow the process down. And so when we're talking about internships, we are talking about them having 3 or 4 months to figure out that this is okay. It might take them 6 months or 7 months to figure out that, yeah, it's totally fine. Yeah, so it's really tempting sometimes to go to the place where you have family, but it may not be the fastest way to get through the process. Yeah, and that's something essentially to think of. Get your first security clearance at a different location, and then apply for the home location the next time. Because again, most of the time this is no problem at all. Very few people are actually related to Mossad agents, for example. So it just takes time.
Okay.
Yeah. The last thing I just wanted to touch on is the personal statement. And there are 4 different questions here that you should think of as essentially one single statement, because that's how the office that you apply to is going to read it. They're not going to get this application in like a Google form. They're going to have essentially a shortened version that just has your answers to these 4 questions. So they cover why you were interested in whatever you said you're interested in. Why are you qualified or to work in that area? And again, because I've taken classes in this area, or because I have learned Spanish or French. This doesn't need to be like fancy schmancy. This is an internship. You're not expected to like be an expert in political military affairs and know everything about military sales to other countries, for example. That would be really weird, actually. So why are you interested in what you say you're interested in? Why are you interested in public service generally? Why does the State Department sort of appeal to you as a place to intern? How does it fit in with what you're thinking about career-wise? And anything else you'd like to share about your background and qualifications. So again, you can think of these, each of these has word counts, but you can think of these as an integrated essay and make sure that you hit all of those points throughout all of the 4 of those questions. So let's say you have a lot to say about interest in public service, but don't quite have enough, it's spilling over past those 1,000 words. It's okay to mention that in question 35, anything else you'd like to say. As long as, again, you're putting forward a coherent message that demonstrates you've got basic writing skills and is honest. This is not the place to say, I've always dreamt of being a State Department or being an American diplomat, if you have not always dreamt about being an American diplomat. It's okay. Everybody comes to the State Department from a different path. It took me years before I actually applied to join the Foreign Service because I was like, oh, it's really bureaucratic. Oh, all you do is go to fancy parties in Europe. It took me a while before I saw the types of positions, the types of jobs where I could impact people's lives and that I actually cared about. So walking through that story, talking about where you started, what your interest ended up being, that's what makes a really interesting path. That's what makes an interesting application. Somebody that people would actually like to talk to and be interested in. Because at the end of the day, these aren't big offices. Maybe 10 people, and you're one of 10 people, and they want to like you, and they want to be interested in you. And that's not hard to demonstrate, because y'all are great. That's the last part of the application process I wanted to cover. Any other questions on summer internships or the application process? Cool. As promised, I did want to cover a couple. Oops, oh, I lost my person. Did want a couple of other things. So these internships are now paid again, which is fantastic. They literally just started doing this a couple months ago. So it's a great opportunity for everyone. It actually makes it easier and possible to do internships in Washington, D.C. in particular, where it can be really expensive to live. The cool thing about my parents being in Athens when I was in college, my dad was in the Army and he was in the military at the embassy. That was great. I got to go visit them in Athens, but I had no home in DC anymore. So it wasn't like doing those DC internships wasn't financially possible for me. But there are a bunch of additional scholarships, fellowships, and other things that you might want to consider applying for. For sophomores, I still have something for you sophomores, yay! The Wrangell Summer Enrichment Program is a very prestigious, and sophomores and juniors can apply for this. It's a very prestigious summer enrichment program. It's very similar to the State Department internship program, but then you also go to Capitol Hill. You also go to DOD. You also learn more about the foreign affairs community more generally. And it really sets you up both for foreign affairs careers and for future extremely prestigious fellowships like the Pickering and Wrangell fellowships for grad school. So applications for that are not due until February. We've got a lot of time to think it through and get mentored through the entire process by your faculty and colleagues here. In addition, for people who are applying for internships this summer as juniors, There are lots of additional sources of funding for the internships. So the Council of American Ambassadors can provide extra money for housing. There are a wide range of fellowships. That also provide plus-up money. For example, here we go. The Thursday Luncheon Group, the Hispanic Employees Council, the Asian American Employees Council has also gotten involved. They'll have scholarships specifically designated and designed to boost underrepresented groups in the State Department. And these are on top of the State Department internship salaries. So this is additional money that can help you just make ends meet while you're working in DC. Right. And last but not least, if you are a senior, you should consider applying for the Pickering and Rainbow Fellowships. Oops, sorry. Sorry, if you're a junior, next year consider applying for the Pickering and Rainbow Fellowships. These are kind of like Rhodes Scholarships, but for joining the State Department. So they're like Rhodes Scholarships in the sense that you need to plan and prepare a couple of months in advance to get your application together because they're super competitive, but they're not like insanely competitive like the Rhodes Scholarship. There's not a multi-stage application process with multiple interviews and 10 references and things like that. It's much more normal, but you do need to prepare in advance. You can also apply to be a Presidential Management Fellow, which is a great entry path into the civil service in the State Department, or frankly, anywhere in the US government. This is not State Department specific. Last but not least, you guys should definitely consider language scholarships and language fellowships. The Critical Language Scholarship is managed by the State Department, and it offers summer scholarships, summer funding for people at any level of language learning. So for some languages, they will provide funding to start from scratch on Arabic, Chinese, Persian, Turkish, some of the harder languages. If you want funding for Spanish or French, you need to already have a couple of years of language study, but there's opportunities on those fronts as well. And then the Boren Scholarship is if you want to go study a language while you're overseas. So they're all fantastic. And only the Boren Scholarship has an ongoing requirement for service to the government. You're supposed to say that you want to stay in the State Department or Department of Defense or whatever. Questions?
Do you need to be a student for the Boren?
Pardon?
Do you need to be a student for the Boren?
There are a couple of different types of Boren scholarships and fellowships for undergrads and graduate students. And they are more flexible about the ongoing student requirement. So it's one of those things worth Googling and seeing like the 20 different versions that you can apply for. Yeah. Yes?
Oh, I know the person that asked earlier, but I have a question about senior career paths in the last one.
Sorry, can you repeat?
I know the person that asked earlier.
Yeah, the PMF?
I had a question about like the career paths for seniors on the
Yeah.
last slide. Can you go to the
Oh, sure.
Thank you.
So obviously taking the foreign service exam, I'd be happy to talk more about that. It's the one thing that I left off the slides. But something that only seniors, either graduating from an undergrad program or a master's program, which admittedly is more common, you have to be a senior and you have to be applying your senior year for the Presidential Management Fellowship. And this is essentially a 2-year fellowship. They used to call them interns, but you're not an intern, it's a paid job. It's a 2-year paid position, entry-level position, somewhere in the US government. State Department takes a lot of people, but so do every other agency, so does the White House, all parts of the government too. It's competitive, it's prestigious, but it's also very doable and possible. And it's one of the best paths into government service because oftentimes it's very difficult to just apply for a civil service job and actually get any response or feedback from anywhere in the State Department. Having paths like this, like the PMF or like the Foreign Service exam, is just much more feasible and doable. Would you guys like to hear me talk about the State Department Foreign Service exam?
Yes.
All right, let's do it. It's changed since I took it. Take at least the initial part of what I'm talking about with a bit of a grain of salt. The first exam that I took was very similar to like the SAT or the GRE. a very standardized exam with an additional set of questions about current events. The new exam, just like how the SAT has been evolved and updated over time, the new exam is designed to get a wider range of skill sets. So there are writing sections in addition to multiple choice questions, things along those lines. But the advice on how to do well on that exam is the same as it was when I took it. You can't crash on learning world events. Really the best way to prepare for that part of the exam is essentially to read the newspaper every day. Just choose one story, take 5 minutes, and read an article about international affairs. One a day, it builds up over time. I always impress my students by being able to answer really random questions about lots of different things in the world. And the only reason I know about lots of different things in the world is because I just read the newspaper. And that is what's going to give you the advantage there. And it's not something that you can really cram. It's just a gradual knowledge and experience that you need to build up over time. And this is one of those reasons why people tend to do better the second time they take the exam. It's partly because, oh, okay, now I understand how the process of the exam, but it's also just you've built up more experience and skill over time, and that's normal. There's this first sort of standardized exam that everybody goes through. I'm pretty sure this is still true, but there is a multiple choice question on why do you want to join the foreign service? And yes, there is a correct answer, and it is to serve your country. That's why I've said that like 4 times. It's one of those weird things that they tell you at Georgetown, and eventually the information spreads broadly. So that's the first part, the written exam. After you pass the written exam, then there's an oral exam. And that has been very consistent over time. There are 3 parts to it. There's an individual and personal interview, which is like a normal personal interview. There is a written part to that exam as well. I was given a scenario and had to write a memo about that scenario in a certain time frame. They're looking again for writing skills and also a little bit of creativity. I admit I thought the scenario I was given was really dumb. It was like, come up with a new way to computerize all of the contacts in an embassy. I'm like, why would you want to computerize all the contacts in an embassy? But you have to justify it and come up with different reasons and justifications. And the best way to practice for that is actually taking exams in schools. That's not that dissimilar, written exams. The other thing that it's not dissimilar from is some of the management consultant type experiences where you can find a lot of these case studies online where they're going to give you a scenario and ask you to answer questions. The content is very different, but the same idea of we're not going to give you something that you know and understand. We need to see how you can adapt and evolve and respond to something you don't know and don't understand. So that's the written part of the oral exam. And then the last part, the most famous part of the oral exam, is a group activity. You simulate a country team meeting at an embassy. So what you do is there will be, usually you're taking this exam with 20 or 30 other people and they break you into 2 or 3 groups. So you're in a group of about 10 people. And again, they give you a scenario. I was, I think, diplomatic security. So I was a security officer for my embassy. And they tell you what a security officer does. And they tell you what you're interested in, what your biggest concerns at the embassy are. And they do this for public diplomacy and politics and economics, all the different roles and responsibilities in an embassy. And it's given to you at random. It's not given to you based on your expertise. And your job is, as a group, all 10 people, to talk about the budget for the embassy. You have to come up with an answer to, we have $1 million, how are we going to spend that $1 million? Each person has, projects that would total like $10 million total. So how do you actually answer that question? And there's a secret answer to this too, and that is what is most important is that you all come to an agreement. And this is very true to life, both in the sense that the State Department is very consensus-oriented, but also that you can't just not come up with a budget for the embassy. You actually do have to come up with an answer. And that answer is not, well, let's give a little bit of money to every person. You actually have to decide as a group what the priorities of your embassy are. How are you going to decide for your fictional country that they've given you information on? What is actually important there? Is it public diplomacy? Is it security? Is it economic assistance? There are lots of different options there. So coming together as a group and effectively advocating for your position and your points are the two key points there. And I would just note that I've had a lot of weird experiences, like unique things happen to me, like in my career generally. Like I was hired for my first job on Capitol Hill off my resume. I didn't have any connections at all for that job. And for the Foreign Service oral exams, every single person in my group passed. Now that's 10 people, an entire group passing, when typically just 2 or 3 people out of an entire group of 30 is going to pass. And we all succeeded because we worked really well together. We all advocated effectively for our projects, but the people whose projects did not match MVC goals acknowledged that and stopped advocating for them and talked about how these other things, these other ideas would make more sense. Conceding is not defeat. Conceding actually helped them get in. I happened to get my projects and get in, but it is a consensus building project, and just dying on your little hill, making sure that you get your money no matter what, is not necessarily the best path forward. That's actually not what they're looking for in the State Department. So that's the oral exam. You find out at the end of the day whether you passed or not. There's no waiting period there. They just come in, they tell you, and say, congratulations. They actually told us all as a group because it was unusual and rare that our group all passed. And then after that, you essentially get a point value. You get a number assigned to you based on how well you did on all these parts, and what your language experience is, what your language skills are, and what any prior experience you have is. So you get that point that is assigned to you. I have no idea what mine was, and I have no idea exactly how they decided. But that point determines how long you have to wait to actually join the Foreign Service. You get a security clearance during this time. Because I had done a couple of internships, that made my extensive international experience a little bit easier to cope with. So they both knew me well enough to know that my time in Greece didn't mean I was supporting the Greek terrorists and that I was a target of them, for example. And there are Greek terrorists, just FYI. So that did not take a horribly long part of the time. What your point score matters for is what you decide to join the Foreign Service as. I chose to be a political officer, that's what I was interested in, and you have to have a higher point value to get in as a political officer or public diplomacy officer. If you're interested in management or consular work, visa work, your point can usually be a little bit, tally can usually be a little bit lower because A, they need a lot of those people, and they usually get less applicants in those areas. All right, that's joining the Foreign Service. Other questions on that? That's the process. I can talk a lot more about the different parts, things like that, yeah.
I realized just based on my past experience, the resume required for State Department positions fairly detailed.
Yes.
Are these samples that students can access, or are they posted anywhere?
It's a good question. I
You
have
can share.
not seen any. Honestly, typically when I see those uploaded CVs, what glares out to me is how often students will send me their resumes and they have typos in them. That's what matters more than like the weird detailed requirements. I'm just going to Google something really quick and see if I can find any samples. So that attention to detail really does matter. And so the best way to avoid typos in your resume and your CV is to print it out and have somebody else read it. Anybody will catch them better than you can. I can't catch typos on my computer of things I've written anymore. It's just, it all blurs together. There are a couple of it comes up really fast now on my own Google because, there we go. There's this path-to-foreignservice.com. There are a couple of things like this that are essentially commercial ventures. They will have training programs that they're going to try to sell you on how to take the foreign service exam and stuff like that. I didn't do that. I didn't even do the little, a lot of students at the Georgetown School of Foreign Service will take little programs like this. I never thought they were necessary because, again, you can find out everything you're supposed to do through other means and it's free. But path-to-foreignservice.com at least also has some freely available information, and so that's what I want to look for here on to see if they've got. So they've got some general guidance on like what you might want to read to take the foreign service exam, blog entries on different issues. So let's see if they've got anything. And how to write a resume. It doesn't look like they've got resume samples. It is not likely that your resume is going to be reviewed by an applicant tracker system. It's going to be reviewed by a person. So, there aren't like keywords that you need to make sure you get in there so that you're popping up on different systems. Again, responsibility and accuracy are the key things to remember there. Yeah.
I just wanted to add, last year when some members of the State Department came, you did mention that some of them work in civil service and some in foreign, and you said that don't leave anything off of it, because I guess resumes now, we're told to kind of just put things down that are relevant to the job that we're applying for, but they were stressing and put everything down and want to know every single thing, and that it should be longer than a page. I'm not sure if that's true or not.
That is, again, not the same advice I have been given over time. As more of this process is computerized, some of these resumes and application processes do transfer from one thing to another. So if you want to talk about make sure that every single thing that you've ever done is on there, that is helpful if you're filling in an online form where you have to say, how did you spend your time from here to, to 10 years ago? Yes, you absolutely do need everything you've ever done there. You don't need gaps. If there's a gap in your resume, you need to say, I was a student at that time, even though it's obvious. Because they want to make sure that, again, you've got a full accounting of all your time. But that's more common for initial stages or for security clearance applications. When I was reviewing internship applications, which again it was 10 years ago, but it's still true that I was just sent resumes and personal statements. And if somebody's hiring within an office, they're not, like I was the deputy director of the Iran office in Dubai for my last tour. So as a deputy director, that's the person who does the hiring and firing. And it wasn't just interns that I was looking for. I was pulling people from other agencies to come work for me. I was trying to find people to fill gaps, things like that. So I did a lot of this. And I was not hooked into any of the HR systems. I would never want to learn the HR systems. And that is still true today. The people who are actually making that final decision as to whether to hire you or not, it's just a normal person who is kind of old and not used to all these fancy new systems. And they want a piece of paper that is easy to read, and they want a personal statement that makes sense. Those are the things that the final person is going to make that decision on. So unfortunately, to get there, you do need to satisfy those initial stages. So if, when they ask you to fill in your resume, they're asking you to fill in this extra super duper long stuff, then go ahead and do whatever they say, but make sure you upload that short version of your CV that highlights what's actually relevant, that somebody might actually want to read. Got it. Yeah. Because those don't have to be the same thing, the computer fill-in and the PDF. Yeah. Yeah.
If you didn't have any relevant work experience,
That's okay.
it's okay.
Yeah. Think about how it might be relevant. So think about what it is you might be interested in, and I'd be happy to talk about your personal situation when we're offline. But think about what might be relevant to what you're interested in doing. So right now, for some reason, I've read a lot of student resumes because I'm writing, recommendations for different things. And everybody sends me the resume. I'm like, I don't need your resume, but that's okay. So I see a lot of students who have experience working in hotels. This is a summer internship, maybe it was on the management side, but more often it's in the customer service side. Customer service experience is fantastic. Let's say you want to actually go into public diplomacy. All you do is interact with the public. And, you're a diplomat, or you're thinking about being a diplomat. And that's about essentially, and that's not about making people happy, but it's about resolving people's concerns successfully. So talk about how that customer service experience applies to public diplomacy, or applies to work in, I'm going to talk about terrorism today. Let's talk about democracy promotion, which is another thing I did. Applies to working in an office that it works on assistance programs, because you have some financial management experience. You've at least seen what a budget looks like and understands some of the things that go into that. There are lots of different ways your experience can apply, and part of what they're looking for is how you actually make those connections. Yeah. Other questions? All right, guys, thank you.
There was an email
Yes.
about last time.
Oh, sorry, I got stuck on trying to find resume samples. These are all crappy resume samples. Yeah, so you should feel free. You can do it. You should feel free to contact me if you've got questions at my Gmail account or my Wake Forest account. But Andy Sisk, I also know Andy Sisk, is the diplomat in residence for the Mid-Atlantic. So it's actually his job to go around and do recruiting at universities all across the Mid-Atlantic. And more importantly, he's got a great mailing list. So if you email DIR for director, Mid-Atlantic@state.gov, and say, hey, I got a presentation on working at the State Department, I'd like more information. He'll sign you up for that mailing list. You'll get an email once a month. You'll get announcements when fellowships open, and when internships open, things like that. All right. Thank you, guys. And again, please come up and ask me questions if you have individual cases you'd like to talk about. Thanks.